They say the truth always comes to light, but sometimes it needs a little help finding its way there. In my case, it came wrapped in charitable donation receipts and a very uncomfortable conversation with the IRS. My stepmother thought she was clever, but she underestimated one crucial thing: never mess with a tax attorney's family heirlooms. I'm Sarah Chen, I'm 29 years old, and this is the story of how my stepmother's greed turned her fake charity scheme into the biggest mistake of her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My mother, Elena Chen, had an eye for beautiful things. Not expensive things necessarily, but pieces with soul and history. She collected vintage jewelry throughout her life, each piece carefully chosen and lovingly maintained. There was the Art Deco emerald brooch she found at an estate sale in Savannah, the delicate pearl necklace that belonged to her grandmother who immigrated from Taiwan, and dozens of other treasures that told the story of her travels and dreams. What made these pieces truly special wasn't their monetary value, though some were quite valuable. It was the stories behind them. Mom would sit with me on quiet Sunday afternoons, opening her jewelry box and sharing the tale of each piece. This ring she bought herself when she got her first promotion at the law firm. These earrings were a gift from Dad on their 10th anniversary. This bracelet came from a tiny shop in Prague where she and Dad honeymooned. Each piece was a chapter in her life, and she promised me that someday they'd all be mine. Not because I was materialistic, but because she knew I understood their real value. I was studying to become a tax attorney myself, following in her footsteps, and she'd often joke that I had inherited her attention to detail and her inability to let things slide when something wasn't right. Mom worked at Henderson and Associates, one of the most prestigious tax law firms in Atlanta. She specialized in estate planning and charitable giving, helping wealthy families navigate complex tax situations while ensuring their philanthropic goals were met legally and ethically. She took pride in doing things the right way, always emphasizing that shortcuts in tax law inevitably led to bigger problems down the road. When Mom was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, she fought it with the same methodical determination she brought to everything else. She organized her affairs, updated her will, and made sure every detail was handled properly. The jewelry collection was specifically mentioned in her will, with detailed descriptions and appraisals she'd commissioned just 2 years earlier. She wanted to make sure there would be no confusion about her wishes. Dad was devastated when we lost her. He'd always been the more emotional one in their partnership, while Mom was the practical planner. Without her steady presence, he seemed lost, unsure of how to navigate even the simplest decisions. The house felt empty, and Dad struggled with everything from paying bills to remembering to eat regular meals. That's when Veronica Blackwood entered our lives. She worked as a grief counselor, specializing in helping widowed spouses adjust to life alone. She was everything Mom wasn't: flashy, loud, and always talking about money and status. Where Mom had been quietly elegant, Veronica was all designer labels and expensive highlights. Where Mom chose her words carefully, Veronica never seemed to stop talking. At first, I was grateful she was helping Dad cope. He started eating regularly again, began going out with friends, and seemed to be finding some semblance of normalcy. But as weeks turned into months, I noticed changes that made me uncomfortable. Veronica was always there, inserting herself into family decisions and conversations. She had opinions about everything, from the art on our walls to the car Dad drove. 6 months after Mom's funeral, Dad announced he was dating Veronica. Within a year, they were engaged. I tried to be supportive, telling myself that Dad deserved happiness and that Mom would have wanted him to move forward. But something about Veronica's interest in our family's finances made me uneasy. She was always asking questions about Mom's estate, about what assets had been left behind, about the value of various items in the house. The wedding was a small affair, nothing like the elegant celebration Mom and Dad had planned for their 25th anniversary before she got sick. Veronica insisted on having it at an expensive country club, complete with flowers that cost more than some people's cars. Dad seemed happy, though, and I forced myself to smile and play the supportive daughter. That's when things started to change around the house. Veronica began redecorating, claiming that Dad needed a fresh start and that keeping Mom's things around was preventing him from healing properly. She started with small items, then moved on to furniture and artwork. Each time Dad hesitated, she'd give him that practice counselor voice and explain why letting go was psychologically healthy. I was living in my own apartment by then, finishing law school and preparing for the bar exam. I visited regularly, but not daily, so the changes happened gradually. Each time I came over, something else was different. Mom's favorite reading chair was gone, replaced by a modern leather recliner. The family photos were rearranged, with several of Mom's pictures moved to less prominent locations. But the jewelry collection remained untouched. It sat in Mom's bedroom, in the antique jewelry box Dad had given her for their 15th anniversary. Veronica mentioned it occasionally, suggesting that it was just sitting there gathering dust and that perhaps some pieces should be put to good use. Dad always shut down these conversations quickly, saying the jewelry was mine according to Mom's will and that was final. I was grateful for Dad's protection of Mom's wishes, but I also started to worry about what would happen if something happened to him. Veronica was now his wife, which gave her certain legal rights. I began researching estate law more carefully, paying particular attention to spousal inheritance rights and how they might impact Mom's specific bequests to me. What I discovered made me uncomfortable. While Dad's will clearly stated that Mom's jewelry collection was to go to me, there were potential complications if anything happened to him before I formally took possession of the pieces. Veronica, as his wife, could potentially challenge certain aspects of the inheritance, especially if she could argue that the jewelry had become marital property through some legal technicality. I decided to have a conversation with Dad about officially transferring the jewelry to me sooner rather than later. It wasn't that I didn't trust her, but I'd learned from Mom that when it came to legal matters, it was always better to be proactive rather than reactive. Unfortunately, I waited too long to have that conversation. Dad had a massive heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March. He was in his office at the accounting firm where he'd worked for 20 years when it happened. The doctor said it was quick, that he probably didn't suffer. That was supposed to be a comfort, but all I could think about was that I'd never gotten to tell him how grateful I was for everything he'd done to honor Mom's memory. The funeral was a blur of flowers, condolences, and legal paperwork. Veronica played the grieving widow perfectly, accepting sympathy and casseroles with equal grace. But I noticed she was also asking a lot of questions about the estate, about what needed to be probated, about how quickly various assets could be transferred or sold. 2 weeks after the funeral, I went to the house to collect Mom's jewelry collection. I'd been putting off dealing with it, partly because I was still processing my grief, and partly because I dreaded having to interact with Veronica more than necessary. But I knew I needed to secure the jewelry before any legal complications arose. When I opened Mom's jewelry box, my heart stopped. It was completely empty. Every single piece was gone. The Art Deco brooch, the pearl necklace, the anniversary earrings, everything. Even the small everyday pieces that Mom wore regularly had disappeared. I found Veronica in the kitchen, going through what looked like financial paperwork.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
When I asked about the jewelry, she looked up with an expression of surprise that seemed just a little too practiced. "Oh, the jewelry," she said, not meeting my eyes directly. "I donated it all to charity. Your father and I discussed it before he passed. He thought it would be a wonderful way to honor your mother's memory, since she was always so generous with charitable causes." The lie was so smooth, so confident, that for a moment I almost believed her. But then I remembered Dad's firm stance every time Veronica had brought up the jewelry before. There was no way he would have agreed to donate pieces that Mom had specifically left to me in her will. "Which charity?" I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "The Children's Foundation of Georgia," Veronica replied quickly. "They do such wonderful work, and I know your mother would have approved. I have all the documentation, of course, for tax purposes." That's when I knew she was lying. The Children's Foundation of Georgia had been exposed as a fraudulent charity 3 years earlier. Mom had actually worked on the case that shut them down. There was no way Veronica had donated anything to an organization that no longer existed, unless she was running some kind of scam. But I didn't say anything. Instead, I nodded and told her I understood, then left the house as quickly as possible. Because if there's one thing Mom taught me about dealing with liars and cheats, it's that sometimes the best strategy is to let them think they've gotten away with something while you quietly gather all the evidence you need to prove they haven't. I drove straight to my apartment, my hands shaking as I pulled into the parking garage. The audacity of what Veronica had done was staggering. But what made it worse was how calculated it seemed. She hadn't just stolen my mother's jewelry on impulse. She'd planned this, complete with a fake charity story and mentions of tax documentation. That level of premeditation made my blood boil. The first thing I did was call my mentor, Patricia Goldstein, a senior partner at Mom's old firm. Patricia had worked closely with my mother for over 15 years and had been like a second mother to me throughout law school. She'd also been the one to help Mom organize her estate planning, so she knew exactly what jewelry collection I was supposed to inherit. "Sarah, honey, slow down," Patricia said when I called her in a panic. "Tell me exactly what happened." When I finished explaining, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Patricia spoke, and her voice had taken on the cold, professional tone I'd heard her use in depositions. The Children's Foundation of Georgia was shut down in 2019 for fraudulent activities. Your mother actually consulted on that case. If Veronica claims she donated to them, she's either lying about where the jewelry went, or she's committed tax fraud by claiming deductions for donations to a non-existent charity. Either way, we have a problem. Patricia agreed to meet me the next morning to go over my options. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all those Sunday afternoons with Mom, learning the stories behind each piece. The emerald brooch had been Mom's first major purchase after she made partner. The pearl necklace was the last gift from her grandmother before she passed away. These weren't just valuable objects, they were pieces of our family history. The next morning, Patricia and I met at her office downtown. She'd already pulled Mom's estate file and had copies of the jewelry appraisals spread across her conference table. The total appraised value was over $200,000, but that wasn't what caught my attention. What struck me was how meticulously Mom had documented everything. Each piece had been photographed, described in detail, and appraised by certified professionals. "Your mother was thorough," Patricia said, echoing my thoughts. "She wanted to make sure there would be no confusion about your inheritance. The fact that Veronica disposed of these items without your consent is a clear violation of the will's terms." We spent the morning mapping out a strategy. The first step was to demand documentation from Veronica about the supposed charitable donation. If she really had donated the jewelry, there would be receipts, acknowledgement letters from the charity, and detailed descriptions of what was donated. If she was lying about the donation, she wouldn't be able to produce legitimate documentation. But I suspected there was more to this story. Veronica's mention of tax documentation had been too specific, too confident. She wasn't just planning to steal the jewelry, she was planning to profit from it twice. Once by selling the pieces, and again by claiming inflated charitable deductions on her tax return. I decided to take a different approach than Mom might have. Where she would have handled this through official legal channels immediately, I wanted to gather more evidence first. I needed to understand the full scope of Veronica's scheme before I made my move. Over the next few weeks, I began investigating Veronica more thoroughly. I started by researching her background, looking into her education, her previous employment, and her financial situation. What I found was interesting. Veronica had been struggling financially for years before she met my father. She'd had multiple credit cards maxed out, had been behind on her rent, and had even filed for bankruptcy once in her 20s. But it was her social media presence that really caught my attention. Veronica loved to post about her lifestyle, her shopping trips, her expensive dinners, and spa treatments. What struck me was the timeline. The posts showing expensive purchases and luxury experiences had started appearing just a few weeks after Dad's funeral. She was spending money she shouldn't have had. I also started monitoring the local auction houses and estate sale companies. If Veronica had sold Mom's jewelry quickly for cash, there might be records. I created alerts for several of the more distinctive pieces, particularly the Art Deco brooch, which was unusual enough to be memorable. Meanwhile, I began preparing my legal strategy. Patricia introduced me to a colleague who specialized in estate theft and fraud cases. We discussed the various criminal charges that could potentially be filed, as well as the civil remedies available to recover the stolen property. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I was having coffee with my college friend Jessica, who worked as a bookkeeper for several small businesses in Atlanta. When I mentioned Veronica's name, Jessica's eyes lit up with recognition. Veronica Blackwood? Tall blonde, always talks about her charity work? When I nodded, Jessica continued. She's been coming to the tax preparation service where I work part-time. Really pushy about maximizing her deductions, keeps talking about some major charitable donations she made this year. Jessica couldn't share details about Veronica's tax return due to confidentiality rules, but she could tell me when Veronica's appointment was scheduled. That information gave me an idea. If Veronica was planning to claim fraudulent charitable deductions, she'd need documentation to support those claims. And if she was using a professional tax service, she'd have to provide that documentation to them. I spent the next several days researching tax fraud penalties and IRS whistleblower programs. What I learned was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. The penalties for claiming false charitable deductions were severe, especially for high-dollar amounts. But the IRS also had programs that rewarded people who reported tax fraud, particularly when the fraud involved substantial amounts of money. 2 weeks later, I got the call I'd been waiting for. One of the auction houses I'd been monitoring contacted me about a consignment that matched the description of Mom's Art Deco brooch. The consignor had brought it in 3 weeks earlier, along with several other pieces of vintage jewelry. The timing matched perfectly with when Veronica claimed to have made her charitable donation. I arranged to view the pieces, bringing along Mom's detailed photographs and appraisals for comparison. My heart raced as the auction house specialist brought out the jewelry. There was no question about it. These were definitely Mom's pieces. The emerald brooch, 3 vintage rings, and a pair of diamond earrings that had belonged to my great-grandmother. The auction house had detailed consignment records, including copies of Veronica's identification and signed agreements. According to their paperwork, she'd claimed to be the rightful owner of the pieces and had provided what appeared to be legitimate documentation of ownership. But I knew that documentation had to be fraudulent, since the jewelry had been specifically bequeathed to me in Mom's will. Armed with this evidence, I contacted Patricia again. We now had proof that Veronica had lied about donating the jewelry to charity. She'd actually sold at least some of the pieces through auction houses. But we still needed to prove the tax fraud angle. That's when I decided to take a calculated risk. I called Veronica directly and told her I'd been thinking about Mom's jewelry and wanted to make sure the charitable donation had been properly documented for tax purposes. I offered to help her organize the paperwork, claiming I wanted to make sure Mom's generous spirit was properly honored. Veronica was surprisingly eager to accept my help. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near her house, and she brought a folder full of what she claimed were charitable donation documents. What she showed me was exactly what I'd expected, a completely fabricated paper trail. She had fake receipts from the Children's Foundation of Georgia, complete with official-looking letterhead and signatures. She'd even created fake acknowledgement letters thanking her for the generous donation and detailing the supposed value of each piece. But the values she'd listed were grossly inflated. The Art Deco brooch, which had been appraised at $12,000, was listed as being worth $25,000. Overall, she'd inflated the total value of the donated jewelry from $200,000 to nearly $400,000. I photographed every document while pretending to review them carefully. Veronica seemed pleased with my apparent cooperation and even mentioned that she was expecting a significant tax refund this year thanks to her charitable giving. After our meeting, I drove straight to Patricia's office. We spent the afternoon examining the fraudulent documents and comparing them to legitimate charitable receipts from real organizations. The forgeries were good, but not perfect. There were several inconsistencies that would be obvious to anyone familiar with proper charitable documentation. More importantly, we now had evidence of both the theft and the tax fraud. Veronica had stolen my inheritance, sold at least some of it for personal profit, and was now planning to claim inflated tax deductions based on a fictional charitable donation. The total amount of fraud was approaching $500,000 when you included both the stolen property value and the fraudulent tax claims. Patricia and I spent the next week preparing a comprehensive complaint that detailed every aspect of Veronica's scheme. We included copies of Mom's will, the jewelry appraisals, photographs of the pieces, documentation from the auction house, and copies of all the fraudulent tax documents Veronica had shown me. But before we filed anything, I wanted to make sure we'd caught her in the complete act. Tax returns weren't due for another 2 months, which meant Veronica hadn't actually filed her fraudulent claims yet. If we moved too soon, she might be able to claim it was all a misunderstanding and that she'd never intended to actually submit the false documentation. I decided to wait and watch, gathering more evidence while she dug herself deeper into legal trouble. Because sometimes the best strategy isn't to stop someone from making a mistake. Sometimes it's to make sure they make it so completely and thoroughly that there's no way they can talk their way out of the consequences. The waiting period turned out to be more productive than I'd anticipated. While Veronica believed she'd successfully covered her tracks, I was quietly building an ironclad case against her. Patricia had connected me with Marcus Rivera, a forensic accountant who specialized in tracking fraudulent financial activities. Marcus was particularly interested in cases involving estate theft and tax fraud, and he agreed to help me trace exactly what had happened to all of Mom's jewelry. Working with Marcus opened my eyes to just how extensive Veronica's scheme really was. The auction house consignment was only the beginning. Through careful investigation of local pawn shops, private jewelry dealers, and online marketplaces, we discovered that Veronica had been systematically selling off pieces of Mom's collection over the past several months. She'd been smart about it, spreading the sales across multiple venues to avoid drawing attention. What made her strategy particularly devious was the timing. She'd started selling pieces almost immediately after Dad's funeral, but she'd held on to the most valuable items until closer to tax season. Those high-value pieces were the ones she planned to claim as charitable donations, allowing her to profit from both the actual sales and the fraudulent tax deductions. Marcus estimated that Veronica had already received over $150,000 in cash from selling Mom's jewelry. Combined with the inflated charitable deduction she was planning to claim, her total fraud was approaching $600,000. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was a carefully orchestrated financial scheme. During this investigation period, I maintained regular contact with Veronica, playing the role of the grieving stepdaughter who was grateful for her charitable gesture. She seems to enjoy having an audience for her fake generosity, often mentioning how meaningful it felt to honor Mom's memory through charitable giving. The irony was nauseating, but it also gave me opportunities to gather more evidence. At one of our coffee meetings, Veronica mentioned that she was working with a new tax preparer this year, someone who specialized in maximizing deductions for philanthropic individuals. She even gave me the preparer's business card, suggesting I might want to use his services since I was starting my career as a tax attorney. The preparer's name was Robert Chen, no relation despite sharing my surname, and his office was in a strip mall on the outskirts of town. I did some research on Robert Chen and discovered he had a history of aggressive tax preparation practices. He'd been investigated by the IRS twice in the past 5 years, though no charges had been filed. His client reviews were mixed, with some praising his ability to find creative deductions and others complaining about audit problems. He was exactly the kind of preparer someone like Veronica would seek out. As tax season approached, I intensified my surveillance efforts. I wasn't following Veronica around or doing anything illegal, but I was paying close attention to her social media posts and her public activities. She'd started posting even more frequently about her expensive lifestyle, including photos from a luxury spa weekend and a shopping trip where she bought a designer handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The breakthrough came in early March when Jessica called me with urgent news. Veronica had been to the tax preparation office where Jessica worked part-time, not to file her return, but to pick up copies of documents she'd left there previously. According to Jessica, Veronica had seemed nervous and had asked several questions about whether the office kept records of clients' source documents. This behavior suggested that Veronica was getting worried about her paper trail. Perhaps she'd realized that using multiple tax preparers created unnecessary exposure, or maybe she'd started to understand the legal risks of what she was doing. I decided to wait and watch, gathering more evidence while she dug herself deeper into legal trouble. Because sometimes the best strategy isn't to stop someone from making a mistake. Sometimes it's to make sure they make it so completely and thoroughly that there's no way they can talk their way out of the consequences. The waiting period turned out to be more productive than I'd anticipated. While Veronica believed she'd successfully covered her tracks, I was quietly building an ironclad case against her. Patricia had connected me with Marcus Rivera, a forensic accountant who specialized in tracking fraudulent financial activities. Marcus was particularly interested in cases involving estate theft and tax fraud, and he agreed to help me trace exactly what had happened to all of Mom's jewelry. Working with Marcus opened my eyes to just how extensive Veronica's scheme really was. The auction house consignment was only the beginning. Through careful investigation of local pawn shops, private jewelry dealers, and online marketplaces, we discovered that Veronica had been systematically selling off pieces of Mom's collection over the past several months. She'd been smart about it, spreading the sales across multiple venues to avoid drawing attention. What made her strategy particularly devious was the timing. She'd started selling pieces almost immediately after Dad's funeral, but she'd held on to the most valuable items until closer to tax season. Those high-value pieces were the ones she planned to claim as charitable donations, allowing her to profit from both the actual sales and the fraudulent tax deductions. Marcus estimated that Veronica had already received over $150,000 in cash from selling Mom's jewelry. Combined with the inflated charitable deduction she was planning to claim, her total fraud was approaching $600,000. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was a carefully orchestrated financial scheme. During this investigation period, I maintained regular contact with Veronica, playing the Either way, her nervousness indicated that she was moving toward actually filing the fraudulent return. I decided it was time to set my trap. I called Veronica and mentioned that I'd been thinking about doing some charitable giving myself and wanted to learn more about the process. I asked if she'd be willing to walk me through how she'd handled the donation of Mom's jewelry, emphasizing that I wanted to make sure I did everything correctly from a tax perspective. Veronica was eager to help, apparently viewing this as an opportunity to further cement her story about the charitable donation. We met at her house this time, and she brought out all her fraudulent documentation. She walked me through each piece of fake paperwork, explaining how she'd calculated the values and describing the supposed tax benefits she was expecting to receive. During this meeting, I was wearing a small digital recorder that Patricia had given me. Everything Veronica said was being captured, including her detailed explanations of how she'd inflated the values and her confident assertions about the tax deductions she was planning to claim. She even bragged about how much money the charity scam was going to save her on taxes. But the most damaging moment came when I asked her about the timing of the donation. Veronica explained that she'd been strategic about when to make the donation, timing it to maximize her tax benefits for the current year. She mentioned that she'd considered spreading the donation across multiple years, but decided the immediate tax relief was more important given her current financial situation. This statement was crucial because it demonstrated intent. Veronica wasn't claiming that she'd made an innocent mistake or that she'd been confused about the charity's legitimacy. She was explicitly describing a calculated strategy to maximize fraudulent tax benefits. Her own words were going to be the strongest evidence against her. After that meeting, Patricia and I finalized our legal strategy. We decided to wait until Veronica actually filed her fraudulent tax return before taking action. This would ensure that the crime was complete and that there could be no argument about her intent. We also wanted to coordinate our civil action for recovering the stolen jewelry with the criminal referral we were planning to make. In the meantime, Marcus had completed his forensic analysis of Veronica's financial activities. His report detailed every aspect of her scheme, from the initial theft of the jewelry to the systematic sales and the planned tax fraud. The report included documentation of all the sales we'd traced, photographs comparing Mom's jewelry to items that had appeared at various auction houses and dealers, and a comprehensive analysis of the fraudulent charitable donation claims. 3 weeks before the tax filing deadline, I received a call from the auction house where I'd first spotted Mom's brooch. The specialist I'd been working with had more news. Veronica had returned to consign additional pieces, including Mom's pearl necklace and several other items I hadn't known were missing. She was apparently liquidating the last of the high-value pieces before filing her tax return. This gave me an idea for the final phase of my plan. Instead of simply reporting Veronica's crimes and hoping the authorities would handle everything properly, I wanted to confront her directly and give her an opportunity to confess and make restitution. It wasn't mercy, it was strategy. If I could get her confession on record, along with an acknowledgement of the full scope of her crimes, it would make both the criminal and civil cases much stronger. I arranged one final meeting with Veronica, telling her I had some questions about my own estate planning and wanted her advice. We met at the same coffee shop where she'd first shown me the fraudulent donation documents. This time, I came prepared with copies of everything: the auction house records, the photographs of Mom's jewelry, Marcus's forensic report, and the recordings from our previous conversations. Veronica arrived looking more confident than I'd seen her in weeks. She'd apparently just filed her tax return and was expecting a substantial refund based on her fraudulent charitable deductions. She spent the first few minutes of our meeting talking about her plans for the tax refund money, including a European vacation she was planning to take in the summer. Then I opened my folder and began placing documents on the table between us. I started with the auction house records, showing her copies of the consignment agreements she'd signed. Her face went pale as she realized what she was looking at, but she tried to maintain her composure. "I can explain," she said, but her voice had lost its usual confident tone. "Some of the pieces weren't suitable for donation, so I sold them and donated the proceeds instead." I placed Marcus's forensic report on the table next, showing her the comprehensive analysis of all the jewelry sales we'd traced. The report made it clear that she'd sold far more than just a few unsuitable pieces. She'd systematically liquidated most of Mom's collection for personal profit. But the document that really shattered her composure was the transcript of our recorded conversation from the previous week. As she read her own words describing her strategy for maximizing fraudulent tax deductions, her hands began to shake. She looked up at me with an expression of pure panic, finally understanding that her carefully constructed lies had completely unraveled. The coffee shop suddenly felt very quiet as Veronica processed the extent of the evidence against her. She'd walked into what she thought was another friendly chat with her naive stepdaughter, only to discover that she'd been talking to a tax attorney who had spent months methodically documenting every aspect of her criminal scheme. "What do you want?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at Veronica across the table, her face drained of color as the reality of her situation sank in. Her question hung in the air between us, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to figure out what kind of deal I might be willing to make. But she'd misunderstood something fundamental about this moment. This wasn't a negotiation. "What I want is simple," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I want my mother's jewelry back, all of it, and I want you to understand that there are consequences for stealing from people who know how to fight back." Veronica's eyes darted around the coffee shop as if looking for an escape route. "Sarah, we're family. Surely we can work something out privately. I can pay you back, make this right, without involving lawyers or courts." The word family coming from her mouth made my stomach turn. She'd never treated me like family when it mattered. She'd seen me as an obstacle to be managed, not a daughter to be loved or even respected. And now that she's caught, suddenly I was family again. "You filed your tax return yesterday, didn't you?" I asked, ignoring her plea for a private settlement. "The one claiming $400,000 in charitable deductions for jewelry you never donated to a charity that doesn't exist?" Her silence was answer enough. She'd already committed the final act of her fraud by submitting false information to the IRS. There was no taking it back now, no claiming it was all a misunderstanding. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were copies of all the evidence we'd gathered, along with a formal complaint I'd prepared for the district attorney's office and a detailed referral letter for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. "This is what's going to happen," I said, placing the envelope on the table. "I'm filing criminal complaints for grand theft, estate fraud, and tax evasion. The IRS is going to conduct a full audit of your finances, and they're going to discover that you've received over $150,000 from selling stolen property while claiming inflated charitable deductions for the same items." Veronica's composure finally cracked completely. Tears started streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of self-pity, the crying of someone who'd been caught and was facing consequences for the first time. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "I had debts, obligations. Your father left me with expenses I couldn't handle." I was going to lose everything. This was exactly the kind of response I'd expected from her. Even now, caught red-handed with overwhelming evidence of her crimes, she was trying to paint herself as the victim. She was claiming that her financial problems somehow justified stealing my inheritance and defrauding the government. My father left you the house, his life insurance, his retirement accounts, and his car, I replied coldly. He left you over $300,000 in assets. If you managed to blow through all of that in less than a year, that's not his fault or mine. What Veronica didn't know was that I'd also investigated her spending patterns after Dad's death. Patricia had helped me obtain financial records that showed exactly where all of Dad's money had gone. Designer clothes, expensive spa treatments, luxury vacations, a new sports car, and high-end jewelry for herself. She'd spent Dad's entire legacy on maintaining a lifestyle she couldn't afford, then turned to stealing Mom's jewelry when the money ran out. "The jewelry meant nothing to you sitting in that box," she said desperately. "At least I put it to good use. I helped charities, made donations." "You sold it and kept the money," I cut her off. "And then you created fake charity documents to defraud the IRS. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was about helping anyone but yourself." I stood up from the table, gathering my documents. "You have until tomorrow morning to return every piece of my mother's jewelry that hasn't been sold yet. After that, I file these complaints and you deal with the criminal justice system." Veronica grabbed my arm as I turned to leave. "Sarah, please, I'm begging you. I'll do anything to make this right. I'll pay you back with interest, I'll volunteer for real charities, I'll do whatever you want." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back at her face. "You had the chance to do the right thing when my father died. You had the chance to honor my mother's memory and respect her wishes. Instead, you chose to steal from her daughter and lie about charitable giving. There's no making that right." I stood up from the table, gathering my documents. "You have until tomorrow morning to return every piece of my mother's jewelry that hasn't been sold yet. After that, I file these complaints and you deal with the criminal justice system." Veronica grabbed my arm as I turned to leave. "Sarah, please, I'm begging you. I'll do anything to make this right. I'll pay you back with interest, I'll volunteer for real charities, I'll do whatever you want." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back at her face. "You had the chance to do the right thing when my father died. You had the chance to honor my mother's memory and respect her wishes. Instead, you chose to steal from her daughter and lie about charitable giving. There's no making that right." I left her sitting at the table with the evidence of her crimes spread out in front of her. As I walked to my car, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that I'd caught her and gathered enough evidence to ensure she faced real consequences. Sadness that it had come to this at all, that someone my father had trusted had turned out to be so fundamentally dishonest and selfish. The next morning, Veronica called me at 7 a.m. She'd apparently spent the night trying to figure out damage control, and she'd come to the same conclusion I'd reached. She was completely screwed. She agreed to turn over the remaining pieces of Mom's jewelry and to cooperate with recovering the items that had already been sold. Over the next few hours, she brought me a shoebox containing about a dozen pieces she hadn't sold yet. These were mostly smaller items, rings and earrings, that weren't worth as much individually. The major pieces, the ones with the most sentimental and monetary value, were already gone. But at least I was getting something back. More importantly, Veronica provided me with detailed records of all the sales she'd made. She'd kept meticulous documentation, apparently planning to use the information to support her fake charitable donation claims. Her own records became the evidence that sealed her fate. I filed the criminal complaints that afternoon. Patricia accompanied me to the district attorney's office, where we met with a prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime. The prosecutor reviewed our evidence package and agreed that we had a strong case for multiple felony charges. The combination of estate theft and tax fraud made this a high-priority case, especially given the substantial dollar amounts involved. The IRS referral was equally well received. The Criminal Investigation Division was particularly interested in the fake charity angle, since that type of fraud affects the integrity of the entire charitable giving system. They opened a full investigation within a week of receiving our complaint. But the most satisfying moment came 3 weeks later when I received a call from the auction house where I'd first spotted Mom's brooch. They'd been contacted by law enforcement as part of the criminal investigation, and they were required to return all of the consigned items to me as stolen property. The auction house was cooperating fully, and they were even helping law enforcement track down buyers who had already purchased some of the pieces. Within 2 months, I recovered about 70% of Mom's jewelry collection. Some pieces were gone forever, sold to private buyers who couldn't be traced, or shipped to dealers in other states. But the most important pieces, the ones with the deepest sentimental value, were back in my possession. Veronica's legal troubles were just beginning. The criminal charges resulted in her being arrested and charged with multiple felonies. Her bail was set high enough that she couldn't afford to pay it, which meant she spent several weeks in jail while her public defender tried to negotiate a plea deal. The IRS audit revealed additional unreported income and questionable deductions going back several years, resulting in substantial penalties and interest charges on top of the criminal case. The house that Dad had left her had to be sold to pay for legal fees and restitution. She ended up pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a sentence of 3 years in prison and 5 years of probation. The plea deal also required her to pay full restitution for the value of the jewelry that couldn't be recovered, plus penalties and interest. But beyond the legal consequences, there was something else that felt like justice. The local newspaper covered the case, describing it as a cautionary tale about estate fraud and the importance of proper estate planning. Veronica's mugshot appeared alongside articles about her crimes, ensuring that anyone who searched her name online would discover her true character. I've rebuilt Mom's jewelry collection as much as possible, tracking down similar pieces to replace some of the ones that were lost forever. The new pieces don't have the same sentimental value as Mom's originals, but they serve as reminders of the importance of protecting what matters most. The experience taught me that sometimes patience and careful planning are more powerful than immediate confrontation. By taking the time to gather comprehensive evidence and build an airtight case, I ensured that Veronica faced real consequences for her actions. She'd underestimated me, assuming I was just a grieving daughter who could be easily deceived. Instead, she discovered that stealing from a tax attorney's family was the worst financial decision she'd ever made. Mom always told me that the law was a tool for protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. In this case, it was also a tool for ensuring that greed and dishonesty don't go unpunished. Veronica thought she was clever, but she learned that there's always someone smarter, more patient, and more determined than you are. Sometimes, that someone is the daughter of the woman whose memory you tried to erase for profit. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.